Thank you for coming. As a chairperson for this session, we have Professor Kevin Flannery, who is well known in our faculty, of course, member of the Faculty of Philosophy at the Gregorian, who will be chairing this session. And we start by introducing Andrew Pinsent. Thank you.
I'm very happy to introduce to you all our next speaker, Father Andrew, excuse me, Father Andrew Pinsent. Father Pinsent is Research Director of the Ian Ramsey Center for Science and Religion, and also a member of the Theology and Religion faculty at the University of Oxford, which is a university in England. You may have heard of some. He was formerly a high-energy physicist, that is, a physicist of high energy, not high energy, on the Delphi experiment at CERN, and has degrees in philosophy and theology from the Pontifical Gregorian University. He has also a second doctorate in philosophy from St. Louis University. He is the author of the book by the title of The Second Person Perspective in Aquinas' Ethics, Virtues, and Gifts, published in 2012. And he's author also of a wide variety of other publications on virtue ethics, on neurotheology, science and religion, the philosophy of the person, divine action, and the nature of evil. So it is with great pleasure that I present to you Father Andrew Pinsent. Thank you.
I have a few introductory remarks. First, as Father Kevin mentioned, my background was also in physics. I have quite strong views about what physics can and cannot do. If you'd like me to discuss my views on these matters during the Q&A, I'll be very happy to do so. The other introductory remark I'd like to make is to say that I only finished this paper a few days ago, and so it is with a sense of nostalgia and a slight degree of embarrassment I have to apologize to two of my former professors, Father Kevin and Father Caruana, for handing my written work in late. The title of my talk is Naturalism and Supernaturalism, and just to manage your expectations, the slides have the bullet point summaries of what I'm going to say. Like a fish left gasping out of water, one usually only knows that one has been immersed in something when that thing is absent or changed. As Aristotle says, we value sight more than the other senses because it brings to light most clearly the distinctions between things, a distinction made explicit by artists using the visual artifact of the boundary or outline. Similarly, the faculty of insight, including the exercise of insights to understand natures and naturalism, requires contrast for clarity. After all, something that is in or with everything, undifferentiated, might well be unknowable. For this reason, it is not surprising that the concepts of natures and what is natural have usually become foci of human attention in the context of a potential or actual contrast. These contrasts take varied forms and in many cases underpin some of the most important debates in philosophy, theology, and science. The general pattern of these debates is fairly consistent, namely an argument over the specification of a distinction between what is natural and something else. In many of these debates, one or other of the differentiae is often attacked as meaningless, unknowable, unjustifiable, or denoting an empty set, so that the distinction, whatever its hypothetical or supervenient status, lacks a real difference. For example, the contrast between natural and mechanical may be denied as anything more than a division of convenience for those who hold that living things are fundamentally meat machines or gene machines. Similarly, the contrast between natural and unnatural in the context of ethics is held to be meaningless by those who deny that the object of a personal action can be intrinsically evil. The contemporary focus on naturalism follows the same pattern. As Professor Caruana points out in the preface to his book, Nature, Its Conceptual Architecture, naturalism has become the approach to which many philosophers swear allegiance, even though there is no clear consensus yet as to what this allegiance really demands. Such philosophers have a habitual respect towards all that science has to say about nature, leaving open a debate about what else might be included within naturalism, but beyond what the sciences can supply or supply directly. On this basis and prejudice, the landscape of knowledge may be characterized by a bright circle of light cast by science, beyond which there is a twilight or debated zone. Beyond this twilight zone, there's an epistemic darkness in which nothing is reliably known or knowable, serving at best as an arena for playful fantasy. It is to this epistemic darkness that the term supernatural is usually appended today, functioning as a warning sign that is comparable to the famous label on the Hunt Lennox globe, "Here be dragons." For many philosophers, this warning sign serves in a practical sense to exclude a priori any consideration of God and special divine action. In popular culture, the term labels a wide variety of strange, unexplained, or paranormal phenomena. For example, there is an American fantasy horror television series called Supernatural. Actually, it's been remade as two series in which the heroes hunt demons, ghosts, monsters, and other such beings. So, actually, when I was doing some research for this talk, I discovered that "Here be dragons" is not actually used that often on ancient maps. So there are two examples, and here's one of them. So beware of the supernatural. Yet the contemporary negative use of the term supernatural should not obscure the fact that the word not only has an original positive meaning, but also denotes one of the most important categories in theology. Indeed, the term supernatural and its contrast with what is natural is arguably the key to understanding theology generally, and even to justifying the existence of the subject as a discipline. That's one of the arguments that Aquinas makes at the very beginning of the Summa Theologiae for the very existence of theology. Yet my impression is that very few students and scholars today grasp the meaning and significance of the distinction of natural and supernatural, a distinction that first became prominent in the 13th century in the context of discussions about the life of grace in relation to the recently rediscovered Aristotelian philosophy of the natures. In this lecture, I'm therefore giving an account of this distinction, including my own recent research into what is meant by the supernatural life of grace for the human person. Finally, having clarified the meaning of the term supernatural in relation to human flourishing, I examine briefly the meaning of human nature in the sense of that with which we are born. It's part 2, the mystery of the supernatural. And I must begin with a confession. I actually began my education at the Gregorian University as an anonymous Warnerian. What is the natural-supernatural distinction? What is its significance for the Christian life? Phrases like a state of grace and a supernatural life had largely faded from Catholic culture and consciousness by the mid-1970s. And I must confess, I entered the Pontifical Gregorian University as what I would now call anonymous Warnerian. Now, I remember my devout Catholic grandmother still referring to a state of grace in my childhood. And I remember my mother telling me once that grace was very important, and she likened it to light, a light, which I thought wasn't a bad picture looking back on it. And I waited anxiously for someone to explain it to me later on, and no one ever did for about the next 20 years. So thanks to mothers and grandmothers. And my interest in this topic and eventual change of perspective was awakened by a passage in an influential book by Father Hans Kung. The book in translation is called Does God Exist? I assure you that Father Kung does in fact think that the answer is yes. But what caught my attention was the following phrase. Actually, I more or less opened the book at random, and I found this phrase fascinating. So this is what he says. There is therefore no two-level reality consisting of a natural substructure of truths of pure reason and a supernatural superstructure of truths of pure faith. The abstract, quasi-Aristotelian, ambiguous, iridescent categories of natural and supernatural have proved inadequate. I got the impression he didn't like the distinction. I don't know. But also, I have to say, Father Flannery, quasi-Aristotelian is used here as almost an abusive term. I'm sorry.
Can't understand.
Okay. So it's a bit like, I think Luther's comment to Henry VIII on the publication of his book Defending the Seven Sacraments. I think he called him a Thomist pig. You know. Anyway, so what interested me in this passage was Father Kung seemed to allude to a battle of ideas of which I had not previously been aware. Distinct quasi-Aristotelian categories of natural and supernatural and a notion of a true two-level reality. What did these phrases mean? I drew two preliminary conclusions from this text. First, Father Kung is a scholar of considerable learning, and if he thinks this distinction touches on matters of far-reaching importance, then he is probably correct. Second, Father Kung, despite his learning, is also a scholar with whom I like to disagree in terms of many of his conclusions regarding faith and morals. And since Father Kung clearly regarded the denial of distinct categories of natural and supernatural as a positive achievement, I concluded I might, faced with the same facts, reach the opposite judgment. At this stage, however, my first priority was to understand the facts. What was the distinction of natural and supernatural? Why was Father Kung so pleased that the distinction had been abolished? I say that inquiries were not easy into this topic. And it took me several years of hard work, both in Rome and the United States, to begin to get an understanding of this whole issue. I'd like to acknowledge a deep gratitude to some of my professors at the Pontifical Gregorian University, including my respondent today, Father Kevin Flannery. And I mentioned on the slides here inaccuracies in commentaries. What I discovered quite early on is that I couldn't trust some of the commentaries. And if you want an example of this, you may recall the Gilby translation of the Summa. If you don't know it, you will have seen it in libraries. It's the big multicolored sets of the English translation of the Summa Theologiae. I get a merit point. And if you open volume 1 of that set and you look at Appendix 8, there's a section on natural and supernatural. And it's completely wrong. I mean, completely wrong. It's nothing to do with what Aquinas says about natural and supernatural. He's talking about evolution. He's talking about levels of ascent in the animal kingdom, not about a distinction of nature and grace. So this worried me because I discovered I couldn't trust even some good scholarship. So it was exploring. It was not easy. And what I want to summarize just first of all are my basic discoveries by the time I left the Gregorian in 2005, and then I'll go on to research after that. So first of all, contrary to what is popularly believed, the term supernatural does not just mean something beyond nature or above nature, although of course it does encompass this negative definition. The traditional use of the word in theology refers to a transfigured life or a new life from God that is a free gift to contingent beings with intellect and will. As such, the natural-supernatural distinction parallels many dyadic contrasts in Scripture, such as between life in the ordinary sense of suke, as in John 13:37, I shall lay down my life for you, and the divinely communicated life of Zoe, as in many references in John and elsewhere. And from another contrast is the contrast between flesh, sarx, versus spirit, pneuma, in the works of Paul. So you get these dyadic contrasts running all the way through Scripture, and the natural-supernatural distinction parallels this. On this basis, and contrary to what is commonly understood, an angel is not necessarily a supernatural being. Since angels are part of the created order and have their own proper natures, they're properly called natural in the Thomistic universe. Only the holy angels with the life of sanctifying grace can properly be called supernatural. I don't know, does the Greg have a course in angelology at the moment? I recommend it. It's a lot of fun. And you're missing out on a lot of fun if you don't. Okay, so that's the first thing. It's not just above nature. It's a different kind of life. It's a different kind of life. The second thing I discovered, if you don't know this already, you need to know this, that the distinction and relation of the terms natural and supernatural was a matter of very fierce intellectual controversy in the 20th century. Hans Kung is one example of someone who's been hostile to this distinction, at least as it was articulated in late Neo-Thomism. But the work at the heart of the debate, when the debate was most explicit, however, was Henri Carnot de Lubac's Le Mystère du Surnaturel, published in 1946, and subsequently censored for over a decade. De Lubac advocated a so-called natural desire for the supernatural, the effect of which was to start to blur the distinction of natural and supernatural, and to cast doubt on the notion of a natural end for human beings without grace, that is to say, a state of pure nature. Obviously, papal documents usually have very diplomatic language, but the denial of the possibility of this state was criticized in 1950 by Humani Generis. And what's interesting is that we've forgotten all these battles. This was the hottest topic in theology in the 1950s, and actually in the preparatory schemas for the Second Vatican Council, the supernatural was one of the main areas of controversy going to be discussed. By the 70s, we'd forgotten about it all. Third, most of the other theologians who've been most influential in the modern academy have also tended to blur the distinction between the life of nature and the life of grace, and that includes Hans von Balthasar. Of particular influence has, of course, been Karl Rahner's supernatural existential, according to which grace is a constituent element of man's existence, and the real possibility of a state of pure nature without grace is doubtful. Pure nature for Rahner is at best some kind of remainder concept. Moreover, even the fact there's been a controversy of this question has largely been obscured, because the effacement of the distinction of natural and supernatural has itself been a self-effacing process. The historical conflicts over nature and grace remain largely untaught to younger generations. In many institutions, a Rahnerian worldview is not taught but absorbed. Fourth, most of the blurring of the distinction between the natural and supernatural in academia has taken place through intellectual proxies, normally by means of a worldview implied by intellectual premises or fashions or manners of approach to topics. I was going to give a very strong line here. I will give it, okay. It is not unknown, for example, for professors in Catholic institutions, or sometimes even for bishops, to cultivate a habit of switching between Christian and non-Christian sources, as if there's no real difference between a Christian and non-Christian way of life, or as if their worldviews are mutually reducible to one another. I recall, for instance, a professor beginning his lectures by stating, only once, but with a strong emphasis, that he was treating philosophical ethics and moral theology as equivalent. I'll state that again, philosophical ethics and moral theology as equivalent. In other words, this professor held that goodness and right action, and the study of such matters, is the same in the order of nature and the order of grace. The worldview implied by this claim is no practical distinction of these orders. On this basis, a holy Catholic life is nothing special, even in principle, over and above a life that is lived as well as humanly possible without the revelation of the Trinity, the Incarnation, and the sacraments. In other words, there's nothing different about being a Christian. Fifth, most of the cultural blurring of the distinction between the natural and the supernatural has also taken place by proxies, often in the context of the liturgy. And obviously, liturgical change is a vast and controversial topic, and here I really think the sign should go up, "Here be dragons." I'm not an expert, but I just draw your attention here to one very widespread tendency, namely the habit of blurring distinctions between the sacred and the profane, the sacred and the ordinary. This tendency is expressed in many ways, an influential example being the Hegelian styles of architecture of many modern churches, We absorb philosophy from our buildings, from the way we practice liturgy, from the conversations, the assumption. This is where the real work is done to form or deform Catholic consciousness. It's very important stuff. So you find a lot of Hegelian churches which emphasize a sort of continuum of ascent towards God from the natural state, instead of privileged access to the awe-inspiring throne of grace. If I had to think of one change that's been most significant, it was the abolition of altar rails. Now, I think sociologically it's a fascinating phenomenon because it was never mandated. No one's ever said, get rid of altar rails. But the whole Catholic world embarked on demolishing altar rails. I was actually working in an American church in St. Louis, and in the 1970s a priest came in and said, we're going to tear up the altar rails. But the laity hid them in the bell tower. And then 20 years later, another priest came in and said, it's a shame we got rid of those altar rails. And, but the sacristan said, don't worry, I had them in the bell tower, and they're all back in place. So it had a happy ending. Just show you one of these churches. Fascinating. This is the Metropolitan Cathedral of Rio. We have one in a similar design in England, Liverpool Metropolitan Cathedral. And whatever the merits of this building, what's interesting is the philosophy communicated by the architecture is a Hegelian philosophy. It's a continuum of ascent model. The distinctions of sacred and ordinary space are downplayed. And this is where philosophy and theology gets communicated to people in daily life, often very strongly. Sixth, whatever the positive effects perceived by its advocates, and I'm very happy, by the way, to be challenged with evidence, I think the collapse has been a disaster. In my assessment, the effect of the blurring of the distinction of natural and supernatural has been an almost unmitigated disaster. Instead of embracing the world and renewing the faith, the net effect has been to dissolve much of the world the church into the world, like an ice cube in a furnace. If, for example, Catholicism and Islam and Buddhism are substantially the same, what, if anything, is unique about Catholicism? Practical questions follow swiftly. Why evangelize? Why should we be converted or seek to convert anyone else? Why give your life for some supernatural cause in the priesthood, religious life, or a sacramental marriage for life, when there is nothing about Catholicism that is different to what is common to humanity? On this point, I note that the decline that religious life across the world, which is a fruit specifically of grace, has been a steep decline in the last few decades, in parallel with the loss of the sense of distinctiveness of nature and grace. I mean, the religious life acts as a barometer of grace because it's useless in the worldly sense, and it's like a flower in God's garden. So if we lose our sense of grace, it's religious life that suffers first. So lack of nuns, lack of monks, and so on. So what then is to be done? What is the truth of the relation of the natural and supernatural? Or to put the question in a concrete, practical form, what is a Catholic called to become, as opposed to some classical or pagan ideal of flourishing, no matter how good in their own terms? The problem in responding to these questions is that all the solutions offered seem to be unsatisfactory. To accept the collapse of the nature-grace distinction is simply wrong, in the sense that the loss of distinction does violence to the clear sense of distinction taught by Scripture, tradition, and the magisterium, as well as all kinds of legal, liturgical, and sacramental practices, such as baptism even for infants. The lack of a distinction also fails to correspond to what is known from experience, namely that the most perfect instances of the life and grace and the life of nature are in fact different from one another. In simple terms, a saint is not the same as a classical ideal of perfection, such as the Aristotelian phronimos, even when it is hard to articulate precisely the nature of the differences between these two sorts of lives. Moreover, it should be clear, the solution dissolves the life of grace into nature, which in effect reduces the Catholic life to something that at best supervenes on a natural life without transfiguring that life. To advocate this solution is in effect to advocate the destruction of the Catholic faith. Moreover, the halfway solution offered by de Lubac also fails, since it does not provide any firm basis for resolving the issues. Indeed, a plain reading of his claim that human beings have a natural desire for the supernatural comes close to self-contradiction. See if the bell's agreeing or not. If one sets aside modern prejudices about the term nature as a strange occult quality, as Newton described it, and goes back to Aristotle, nature is simply the fully developed form of a thing capable of imminent self-perfecting action, or more precisely, the fully developed perfection of the class to which the thing belongs. On this basis, the acorn has the nature of an oak, and the human embryo has the nature of a man. Aristotle says what each thing is when fully developed, we call its nature, whether we're speaking of a horse, a man, or a family. If therefore one claims there's a natural desire for a supernatural end, the one true end of human beings that is sought is both its natural end, since that's what it seeks to become by nature, and at the same time above or beyond its natural end. So what is sought both is and is not its natural end, which is one instance of one formulation of the famous principle of non-contradiction. Faced with these unpalatable options, one might conclude the only viable course is to return to the clear distinctions of natural and supernatural typical of Neotomism. But this option also has problems that contributed to the genesis of the modern crisis. The language of pre-1960s Catholicism often resorted to vertical metaphors, such as a higher life, to communicate the distinctness of the supernatural life, a metaphor based on the natural etymology of the term supernatural. This approach turned out to be a deadly false friend or Trojan horse. If we talk about a higher end, what is the scale of proportion? Moreover, if there's a scale of proportion, upon what basis can a difference of degree become the basis of a difference of kind between nature and grace? Although the Neotomists defended strongly the distinction of natural and supernatural and saw the dangers that would result from its abolition, the metaphors with which they communicated understanding were incompatible with their formal claims. The resultant cognitive dissonance of a two-tier approach is one reason why the approach eventually imploded. If progress is to be made, one must go back to basics. What is the supernatural life of grace? What are the metaphors to which it can be related? Is there a more successful metaphor for the distinction of nature and grace than the misleading vertical metaphors and two-tier accounts of Neotomism, a distinction first blurred by de Lubac and then erased? Since the life of grace is meant to be the life of a Christian, what is at stake is Catholicism itself. So, third part, maps and meanings of the supernatural life. To understand what's gone wrong in understanding the relationship of the natural and supernatural, it is important to return to the theological sources. Most factions in the debate invoke St. Thomas Aquinas, and for good reason. As the Aristotelian philosophy of natures was being assimilated by Christian theologians in the 13th century, the need to clarify this distinction became urgent, and the tools for making this clarification became available. Aquinas uses the term supernaturalis more than 200 times directly and refers to the concept indirectly on very many other occasions. Indeed, Aquinas brought the language of naturalis and supernaturalis into mainstream theology, a distinction given an infallible magisterial significance, most notably in the document De Filius of the First Vatican Council, that of course is also mentioned in the Second Vatican Council and elsewhere. The fundamental challenge that Aquinas faced in the 13th century, and which we still face today, is a reconciliation of three statements, all of which seem prima facie true, but which cannot all be correct. First statement, man has a nature, and therefore has a univocal end that expresses that nature. Second statement, man is called to an end that consists of knowing God and being like God. Third statement, the nature of man and the essence of God are disproportionate. In certain places, Aquinas looks as if he defends the first statement, the univocal end of man, a particularly important text being the Prima Secundae, question 3, article 8. On this basis, de Lubac built his case that the one end of man is supernatural and there's no natural end, or rather that the two are equated, an approach taken by many other theologians of the Academy in the late 20th century. Nevertheless, Aquinas also offered a daring alternative, since in many places, but most explicitly in his Questions on the Theological Virtues, he states that man has a twofold end, an end which is proportionate to human nature, that can be obtained by means of our natural principles, though not without God's help, and a happiness surpassing man's nature, which man can obtain by the power of God alone. This supernatural end involves sanctifying grace, the theological virtues, and all kinds of other dispositions that we do not have by nature, but are given to us by God. The question of the natural end, so achieving the supernatural end means achieving the natural end as well, ultimately and in some form. The question of the natural end is a more subtle one, but in his work on evil, questions 4 and 5, Aquinas examines the case of those who die with original sin, but without any actual sin. Aquinas claims that the souls of these ungraced innocents have no desire for what they cannot attain, and experience neither pain nor any sense of loss. So for these innocents, at least, in Thomas's system, there's no natural desire for the supernatural. Given the challenge of reconciling these different interpretations of Aquinas, it's not surprising that a great deal of debate surrounds the validity of de Lubac's interpretation, which has been criticized in recent years, particularly in the work of Lawrence Feingold. Rather than adjudicating between his interpretations directly, however, I think a more fruitful approach is to actually ask the question, what is the supernatural end? What does it look like? What does it mean to flourish as a human being in a life of grace? Both the defenders of the natural and supernatural distinction and the innovators resorted to vertical metaphors to communicate the meaning of this distinction. And I think that temptation is reinforced by our Cartesian culture. So if you start talking about ends, it's very, very tempting to think of ends in space. You may, no matter how you say, that's not what I mean, it's very hard to stop imagining it as an end in space. As many works in psychology, philosophy, and even neuroscience have re-emphasized in recent years, the mind does not grasp truth simply by formal reasoning, but by an understanding arising from the connection of words via metaphor to some kind of embodied experience. So is there a better embodied experience to which the notion of a supernatural life of grace can be related? So, now in the case of nature alone, without revelation or sanctifying grace, the issue is relatively straightforward. Rahner's claim that a life of pure nature is a theoretical remainder concept is actually rather implausible, given the obvious counterexample of the Nicomachean ethics. Perhaps providentially, this work provides an account of pure nature without revelation or special divine action. Aquinas himself wrote an influential commentary, and although scholars in recent decades have raised subtle objections to his commentary, these objections should not obscure its main lesson. Aquinas attempts to treat the Nicomachean ethics on its own terms, without reference to the gifts associated with the life of grace. The existence and approach of this commentary therefore underlines the fact that Aquinas does not regard the pure nature presented in the ethics as a nonsensical concept without grace, or as a mere remainder concept. Given that Aristotle's work and Aquinas' commentary present very detailed accounts of the life of nature, the challenge is to find an equivalent account of the life of grace. What is needed, in effect, is the Christian version of the Nicomachean ethics. So we're familiar for 23 centuries with a certain description of human nature on its own, before you get Revelation, Jesus Christ, the Holy Spirit, the Church, and all the stuff that made us a bit different. We got that, but what we really need is the Christian version of the Nicomachean ethics, and we need a metaphor that fits it. Just as the Nicomachean ethics has habituation. Well, fortunately, Aquinas has already done this work, even though the account as a whole is generally ignored or typically divided into small fragments that are then selected and filtered through a more Aristotelian interpretation. That work is, of course, Aquinas' extraordinary account of supernatural flourishing in the second part of the Summa Theologiae, especially the 189 articles of the Prima Secundae, questions 55 to 89, and the 815 articles of the Secunda Secundae, questions 1 to 170. These articles constitute the largest, most detailed account of virtue ethics in human history, an account of human flourishing oriented towards friendship with God in a life of grace. It's really quite staggering how big it is. If you just write down the titles of the articles on the usual kind of separation and size of an A4 sheet, you've got something more than 5 meters long just to write the list of titles of the articles of this great work on the virtues. If we understand this account, we've got a picture of the life of grace. By comparing this account with that of Aristotle, we then have a picture of the relationship between the natural and the supernatural life. And if we understand this relationship, we understand what is meant to be a Christian, as opposed to the classical picture of human flourishing. The problem, however, is that Aquinas' account of virtue ethics in the Summa Theologiae has proved extraordinarily difficult to interpret, a point emphasized by some extremely well-informed and well-respected scholars, including Alistair MacIntyre and Jean Porter. The problem is not a lack of information. We've been writing commentaries about Aquinas' virtues for many centuries. The problem is a lack of a synthetic picture, a metaphor to which all the details of Aquinas' account can be related in a single, coherent, and fruitful image. In the case of Aristotle, the metaphor is straightforward and well known, namely habituation in a manner comparable to learning a musical instrument. In the case of Aquinas, this metaphor does not work. Aquinas includes too many perfective attributes that do not fit into this picture, such as the integration of virtues with gifts, beatitudes, and fruits. Just show you a small section. I spent a long time drawing up Excel spreadsheets of Aquinas' articles. I had them pasted all over my walls, trying to understand what he's doing. And it's fascinating. If you just look at the index, you can't see it. You have to look at the full list of articles. And it's a very systematic structure. He describes virtues, then gifts, then beatitudes, and then fruits. Thomas Aquinas never met a list he didn't like. And if Revelation gives us these lists, he assumes that God has a picture where it fits them all together somehow. And upon that basis, he built this extraordinary account of virtue ethics, which a lot of virtue ethicists treat of a bit like that map I showed at the beginning, here be dragons, because they're scared enough by the virtue bit, they don't want to touch the gifts, beatitudes, and fruits. This is really scary stuff. So, there's the account. Incidentally, he sets out very early on what he's going to do. So right in the preamble of his work on the virtues, he says, look, I'm going to talk about virtues, and then matters connected to them, the gifts, beatitudes, and fruits. But generally speaking, the other stuff isn't touched too often. So in addition, besides this funny mix of even more problems, Aquinas claims that the true or proper virtues can be infused through an acceptance of God's gift of grace, and also lost or cut off by a single mortal sin. Clearly, an Aristotelian interpretation is incompatible with the immediate loss or gain of virtues, but an alternative is lacking. As a result, for Aquinas' virtue ethics, we have literally thousands of propositional statements without a metaphor. And it's a bit like knowing every detail of every bone of the human body, but never having met a living human being. Just show you a few examples of his connections. So he lists courage connected to the gift of courage. So there are three things called courage in Aquinas' virtue ethics. There's the acquired virtue, the infused virtue, and the gift of the Holy Spirit. And then there's beatitudes and then the fruits. And similarly for faith, understanding, knowledge. It's a very organic structure. So, what is the metaphor for Aquinas' account, if there is one? If we get that, we get the supernatural end. If we get that, we get the relationship with nature. And if we get that, we solve our problems. So getting this right is very important. And I spent years trying to figure this out. I present here a brief summary of my answer. For further information, I refer you to my book, The Second Person Perspective in Aquinas' Ethics, Virtues and Gifts. The key to the problem, I think, is not the infused virtues directly, but the infused virtues with the infused gifts of the Holy Spirit. According to Aquinas, the key point of distinction between these two sets of dispositions, virtues and gifts, is that a person is moved by the Holy Spirit by means of the gifts with respect to all the various matters of the virtues. So imagine that's a person with the virtues taking a stance towards some object like a chocolate cake. Now, in Aquinas' model, you've got two personal agents. You've got God and the person with the infused virtues and gifts taking a stance towards some object, and the person being moved by God in relation to the object. Now, this claim might be regarded as a pious observation about an adventitious supplement to the virtues. But taken seriously, however, it reveals a surprising fact about Aquinas' account of the supernatural life, namely that infused dispositions and their associated matters operate in the context of a triadic arrangement that involves two personal agents. A more precise examination of the text shows that the gifts move a person to share God's stance towards the matters of the virtue, where stance denotes a cognitive attitude consequent upon understanding. This description provides a first clue to help explain many details of the secunda secundae, since God takes a stance towards persons, created and divine things, that is different from the phronimos of the Nicomachean Ethics. To give you one example, Aquinas in the Nicomachean Ethics says almost nothing about gossip and backbiting, but he does a little bit in the politics, I think. But anyway, in the Nicomachean Ethics, there isn't much on this. Aquinas has 16 articles, and he regards a lot of this as mortal sin. So it's serious stuff. Or humility. Humility is obviously in the Secunda Secundae, but it's not in the Nicomachean Ethics. So there are lots of these little points of differences. So how is being moved by God in this way to be understood? The notion that its movement is comparable to a mechanical force, like the strings that move a puppet, is easily dismissed. A more subtle interpretation, that the movement can be reduced to the communication of information, can also be ruled out. The triadic scenario of two personal agents and one object, together with a shared stance, suggests instead that the appropriate metaphor is what psychologists today call joint attention. Manifestations of joint attention are ubiquitous across a vast range of interpersonal interactions, but especially clear in interactions between parents and their very young children. These interactions include infants recognizing faces and smiling back, raising hands to be lifted up, pointing, gaze following, and reciprocal turn-taking. Such activities are characterized by shared awareness of shared focus, together with a shared attitude towards the thing or event in question. Until very recently, we thought actually human beings were the only beings that pointed. Actually, we have slightly changed that view now, because we discovered that elephants can point. It's just very hard to perform the experiment. So, but the full range of joint attention is something that seems to be unique to human beings, and this is how our development gets started. So a few minutes after being born, a child already looks at the parent's face, which is pretty amazing, because the child's never seen the world before, let alone a face. By sharing an attitude, joint attention also brings about a change in the stance of one or both persons towards a common object of attention, a change that is also sometimes described as a movement. In other words, I, engaged in joint attention with you, may be moved to share, at least momentarily, in the common stance with you to the object of attention. Moreover, if I desire harmony and a possible future friendship with you, then some such stance is likely to persist even when you seem to be absent. I will want to love what you love, especially when I have the confidence that what you love will be lovable because it's good, even when what you love does not always seem especially lovable to me in my initial unformed state. That's an example in my own life as going to seminary. So such a movement suggests that a natural metaphor for the process by which a form, which may be called an infused disposition, might be communicated by joint attention from one personal agent to another. And I have several nieces, and it's very interesting to see how they learn temperance when they're very young. And what's interesting is they're not very good Aristotelians to begin with, hopefully later on. But what you see is how they learn at the lunch table, dinner table. And you see this little girl here. She's not interested in the peas. She's interested in the interaction with the parent. You see, it's a game. And this second personal interaction often makes the food interesting to the child. It's an everyday aspect of character development, not in Aristotle's account of the virtues, much as I love Aristotle. I think he treats children as to be steered by pleasure and pain, but this is something more than that. So, as I've written in detail elsewhere, once one begins to think of the operation of infused virtues and gifts in terms of joint attention, many of Aquinas' claims cohere and make sense. For example, as noted previously, the immediate gain and loss of the infused dispositions of virtues and gifts is one of the most perplexing of Aquinas' claims. The metaphor of joint attention oriented towards friendship suggests an interpretation. An act of betrayal of a friend can be a single action, following which the possibility of friendship is suspended. This suspension does not mean that all acquired habits suddenly vanish, but these habits are no longer conducive to the flourishing of the relationship. Hence, by a single action, habits can cease to be virtues, since the final goal of the infused virtues is love or friendship. This is consonant with Aquinas' claim that infused virtues are cut off, excluduntur, by a single mortal sin. That's the bad news. The good news is that a single act of reconciliation can reintegrate these habits to the final goal of love or friendship, turning habits back into virtues. Combined with the reading of Aquinas' other claims, the metaphor of joint attention unites these claims into a single coherent and plausible picture. Moreover, the picture corresponds closely with recent developments in experimental psychology and neuroscience, which imply a central role for joint attention in forming character, even if such attention is only implicit. And to give one of many examples, if you have an honesty box in the student house and you put a pair of eyes onto the honesty box, contributors tend to be more honest. And it's just the implication of another person changes one's moral stance towards the action. Or to give another example, what makes avarice a vice is not principally the failure to keep to a rational mean, but the loss of relationship to other persons through a disordered desire for money. I wrote a paper on this. I started it with a rather dramatic and awful image about the man crushed to death in Walmart by shopping trolleys, shopping carts in the sales. And that's an image of avarice. The bigger picture is that the destruction of the I-thou relationship is what makes the vice a vice. So what then is the supernatural life of grace? The answer I propose is ultimately straightforward. The life of grace is one characterized by joint attention with God, made possible by special divine gifts. Recent work in psychology and philosophy also suggests that joint attention is closely associated and possibly even synonymous with the I-thou or second-person relatedness of the kind to which Martin Buber drew attention. Given the close connection between joint attention and what might be called second-person relatedness, expressed in the second-person grammatical forms such as the I-thou binary pair, the life of grace can be described equivalently as follows. The life of grace, or the supernatural life, is one of second-person relatedness to God, as I to thou, that infuses new dispositions towards God and all the created things with which the person in the state of grace interacts. Now, it's not a different world, it's a different perspective on the same world. This life culminates in what Aristotle claimed was impossible, and indeed is impossible without grace, namely friendship with God. I'll just go back a little bit. I want 10 minutes, perfect. Just curious, another big issue is the hiding of the face, its effect on morality. And I remember from being in Italy that if if you want to behave, well, I've heard, if you want to behave badly at the Viennese carnival, you put the Venice carnival, you put a mask on. So it's like a particularizing of the face, having an impact on certain social norms. And of course, this has also impact upon issues surrounding the veil and in certain European countries today. So just finish off this section with comparing two passages. I'm still never quite got over my excitement that ancient philosophers talked a lot about God. That was one of the great excitements coming to the Greg and discovering that fact. But what's interesting is the grammar. So Aristotle talks about God being a living being, eternal, most good, so that life and duration, continuous and eternal, belong to God, for this is God. And Augustine, several centuries later, says, "Late have I loved you, O beauty so ancient and so new, late have I loved you. I tasted you and now I hunger and thirst for you. You touched me and I burned for your peace." For 7 minutes. So, concluding remarks. What is human nature? Natural completion is not incoherent, but lacks second-person relatedness to God. We have a name for this state in human relations. In human relations, the associated condition is autistic spectrum disorder. And I stress this is a metaphor, like blindness, often used as a metaphor. A state of pure nature into which nearly all of us are born is spiritually autistic to God. To understand that metaphor, you've got to read about autism. It's so fascinating. But when I was in the United States, my supervisor, Eleanor Stump, made me read a book called The Siege by Clara Claiborne Park about a mother bringing up an autistic child. And I didn't want to read this. I wanted to study Aquinas. And this is a lesson that you must listen to your supervisor, because it was very, very important. And the mother in this book notices something is wrong, because at the age of 2, the child doesn't point. The child doesn't invite the mother to share awareness or shared focus. And she resolves to begin the siege, to bring the child out of this state into a world where she can enjoy the relationship with the people around her. And there's also some wonderful work done by Peter Hobson, very subtle work on studies on autism and comparisons. He uses a phrase, it's the same phrase Aquinas uses for the gifts of the Holy Spirit. He says, they were not moved. They were not moved. So a few final comments. Prospects for pure nature. This is a big political issue. Is a naturally good society plausible and viable? In an early post-Christian society, infused by grace for several centuries, the effects of the loss of grace might not be apparent at first. But for Aquinas, the state of pure nature is like a wooden barrel of wine without its hoops, at best a state of unstable equilibrium. And to see the effects of what's going to happen if we lose Christianity, I invite you to look at what's happened to art. So this is a vision of human happiness in 1432. It's my favorite picture. It's a Van Eyck Mystic Lamb. And here you have a second-person relationship to God, shared awareness or shared focus around the Lamb of God, and you see nature perfected. And now watch what happens next. So first, we start to get rid of the saints. The saints become rather small, and the focus shifts to the landscape. It's the penitence of St. Jerome in 1524. And then a bit further on, the church has receded into the background. The focus is on the natural world. A little bit further on, it's the height of English landscape painting, Constable's The Haywain. And it's beautiful, but it's interesting what's not there. There's no cross, no sacraments, no saints, no concretely given supernatural, no halos, all that's gone. And what happens next? So Van Gogh's Wheat Field with Crows, 1890, and look what's happening. The road isn't going anywhere, and the picture is becoming indistinct. I finish off with Jackson Pollock's Enchanted Forest in 1947. And I apologize for the purists among you, because I turned it on its side. I don't want to make a value judgment. I've got into trouble making value judgments with these paintings. So you can make the value judgment yourselves. But all I want to convey to you is the theological narrative shapes the way we look at the world. If we lose it, it will certainly have an effect on the way we look at our world. And not just in art, but in literature, maybe even in science in the end as well. You can see the same dynamic in this one picture, the Hieronymus Bosch, The Garden of Earthly Delights. The good news is when there's a focus on grace, we get beauty back again. And that's, I had a wonderful visit to the Sagrada Familia. I'm very impressed with the Sagrada Familia going up in Barcelona. It's one of the most secular cities in Europe, building one of the most extraordinary cathedrals in the world. And very innovative. You see, the faith is still creative. The faith is still fruitful. Another way of thinking about what's happening now is the loss of understanding. It can be compared, has been compared by some, to, if you like, a destruction of the right hemisphere cognition on the world. So as we lose faith, we lose the grand narrative, we lose the big picture stuff. We can measure things very well. We can do that. We're very good at that. And we're very good at high precision manufacturing, empirical observation. That doesn't mean we're going to make sense of it all. And it's almost as if we've got a fragmentation going on in science at the moment as well. Yet another way of thinking about the same issue, actually a lovely one, is The Snow Queen's Castle by Hans Christian Andersen. It's really a story of how if you lose the I-thou relationship and you get trapped by a rationalistic world, it's like being trapped by the Snow Queen's castle. And it's a little girl in the story who rescues the boy trapped in this state. A little further reading. Do recommend The Siege by Clara Claiborne Park. Wonderful book on joint attention, published by Oxford 10 years ago, Joint Attention, Communication at Other Minds. I've written a book more on Aquinas and various papers on this topic. I also mentioned in passing, I'm currently being funded by the Special Divine Action Project at Oxford University, and I'd like to acknowledge my thanks to the John Templeton Foundation for supporting this work. My very last slide, and a quotation from the first letter of John. Beloved, we are God's children now. It does not yet appear what we shall be, but we know that when he appears we shall be like him, for we shall see him as he is. Thank you very much.